love and intrigue and revolution. Simon Sebag Montefiore discusses his writings on the Romanovs and the Revolution in conversation with Hari Vasudevan. A quick intro. Simon Sebag Montefiore is a best-selling and prize-winning writer of history and fiction with books translated into 48 languages. He has won awards for his writing in both history and fiction. Dr. Hari Vasudevan is a specialist in Russian and European history and Indo-Russian relations and a UGC Emeritus Professor at the Department of History, University of Calcutta. We are really privileged to have both of you here with us. May I please call Simon and Dr. Vasudevan up on stage, please. Dr. Vasudevan, sir. Over to you, sir.
Lovely. Right. Hello. Great to be here. It's my first time in Kolkata, so I'm very excited. And thank you very much for coming to hear me, and I'm just thrilled to be here.
Well, Simon, we're thrilled to have you. And before we begin, I lugged these two books across just to show you the large output in terms of size that Simon's normally associated with. And I'm certain you'll be able to pick up the books whenever you want to, because they're extremely well known, and they've made of Simon somewhat of a phenomena in the West. We normally know of Simon here because of the enormous popularity of his book on Jerusalem. But over the course of the 90s and the 2000s, he really made his mark as the person who put Russia on the map for many people who, at that time, were simply concerned with Russia as a place to make money, that was falling apart, that was having all these funny problems after disintegration of the Soviet Union, and was inspiring tales of the Wild East generally. Simon, along with a troupe of historians as well as people who were on the margins of both history and public writing, managed to bring out a huge number of stories as well as broad histories of what had happened to Russia in the past. And as a result, I think has been a great inspiration for a generation which otherwise in Europe and the United States would really have lost Russia. And the result of this has been that the name of Simon Sebag Montefiore is associated with the Romanovs, it's associated with Stalin's Russia, and most recently with a series of grand novels which somehow pull many of these experiences together. That, I think, has been his grand achievement. I mean, he began with a wonderful book in the 90s on Catherine and her favorite, Potemkin, one of these great viceroys who, a man of enormous energy, who was able to both lead armies as well as to take an interest in design, art, literature, the whole lot. And then he proceeded in the early 2000s to this amazing penetration of the Soviet archives on Stalin. He had luck on his side. It was precisely at the time when the private archives of large numbers of the Soviet Union's leaders were suddenly opened, and at that time, he both had the language, the spirit of adventure, as well as the ability to tell the stories of people's lives, all of which ensured that he broke the standard mold in which Russian history and Soviet history was talked about. Now, this evening, for you, what I wanted to do was to try and persuade Simon to tell us a little bit about how much of this was done and how he's linked much of these things together and what his current interests are. because Simon Sebag Montefiore is not just stuck to Russia. He's not just stuck to Jerusalem. I mean, he's done television on Byzantium. He's done a number of TV programs otherwise. And he's going big in all sorts of other ways as well in terms of his interests. So I'd like to get him to tell us a little bit about that. But before that, if possible, I'd like to tempt you out, Simon, with this question of how it all began and where you think somehow or another you were able to make a difference. I mean, why did people cluster around you? I mean, I remember, in fact, by the early 2000s, there were many people writing on the Soviet Union, many people writing on Russia. But somehow, you were able to do that one thing which has ensured that both historians as well as a larger public has actually taken an interest in your work. I mean, normally when you write nonfiction, you find that historians kind of say, well, you know, he didn't get this right, and, you know, he exaggerated that, etc. I've never seen this happen with any of your work beyond a certain kind of limited quibble. Yeah. You know, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, first of all, isn't it wonderful we're being serenaded? In the beginning, I thought it was the Red Army Choir, but then I realized it wasn't. But anyway, it stopped. But if it starts again, we must celebrate it and enjoy every minute of it as a backdrop. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Harry. And yeah, I mean, people often ask me, you know, how did you first get interested in Russia? And so, you know, the answer is really through a family connection. On one hand, my ancestor Moses Montefiore, who was a Jewish philanthropist and multimillionaire in the 19th century, visited and met several of the Tsars. He met Nicholas I and Alexander II. So my family had actually been to meet the Tsars. So that partly explains my interest in the Romanov family. But actually, my mother's family came from Russia, and they escaped from the pogroms in 1904. And it's an interesting story because they bought tickets for New York in Lithuania on the Baltic coast. And after they'd been at sea for about 2 days, the captain of the ship said, "It's time to get off." And my family said, "We can't possibly be in New York already. There must be some mistake." And the captain, who was, of course, a people smuggler, just said, "Sorry, look at your tickets." So my family looked at their tickets, and the ticket said, they didn't read English very well, of course, and the ticket said New Cork, which is in Ireland, and is a godforsaken city, a godforsaken port in Ireland. So they were dropped off in Ireland instead of New York, and hence we're English and not American. So that is how I came to live in London rather than the States. And but that was the connection also with Russia. You know, my family, I was brought up, the older generation spoke about Russia still. And so I was brought up always being fascinated by it. At university, I studied Catherine the Great and the Enlightened Despots. But my real engagement with Russia really began when the Soviet Union broke up in 1991. I was an investment banker then, a very bad investment banker, as you can imagine. I was hopeless at banking. I lost my money, I lost everybody's money. But at that point, as the Soviet Union started to totter, I went out to Russia and I became effectively a war correspondent. And I wrote about the wars in Chechnya, in Georgia, in the Karabakh. And so this is a wonderful thing for a historian or a future historian to see real empires falling apart on the ground, and also to see the espionage of Iran and Russia and other countries trying to jockey for power in a new empire, in the new provinces, in a new great game, a great game which of course you know all about here in India. So that was a great experience. A couple of times I was almost killed in those wars, and I began to think it was a good idea if I stopped that and wrote books instead. And so I started to work on my Catherine the Great, and I went to the Russian archives to write that book. And the Russian archives, I don't know how many of you have been to the Russian archives. I know you have. But the Russian archives are very different from the Indian archives or the British archives. In the Indian archives and the British archives, the archivists want to help scholars find things. In the Russian archives, they really want to prevent anyone finding anything. And the archivists in Russia are a very strange breed of person. I mean, first of all, they're all interrelated. They marry each other's children, so they're like a special breed of person. And of course, they live underground. They spend a lot of their time in the archives, which are all in nuclear shelters under the archives. And when I arrived to say I was working on Catherine the Great, the very sulky archivist told me that I wasn't old enough and I wasn't serious enough to be shown any of the archives on Catherine the Great and Prince Potyomkin. And so I finally persuaded her to let me see something. And as I sat down in the archive and I sat underneath the gallery, she brought me the first documents and I opened the archive. And as I did, I suddenly heard a terrible squealing, screaming sound, and something landed on my head. And I peeled it off, and it was alive. It was a kitten, a cat. And I looked up, and she was above me, the archivist, and she said, "Welcome to the Russian archives." So that was my first experience of working in the Russian archives. And, you know, from then on, I realized it was a special experience, all on its own. And you've experienced it as well, of course.
But actually, I was going to try and persuade you to go one step further. I think the experiences themselves are rather important in the making of a Russian historian. But, you know, you did, I think, something rather unusual in the sense that practically everybody who's really written about the Soviet state had somehow ignored everything that is personal about the Soviet state. I mean, who marries who loves who, where people have affairs, where they walk, all these things are always somewhere subjugated to a sense of either ideology or counter-ideology or something like that. But your books are not that. I mean, that's where the mold got broken.
Well, I wanted to do something completely different from people had done before. And, lovely, thank you. Is that Coke? Oh, good, thank you. I wanted to do something completely different. And I wanted to do something, first of all, I wanted to do something different. I wanted to do something different with all these books. I wanted to write books that you very generously described earlier that were based on scholarship, but were readable by anybody. And you didn't have to know any history to read them. And that of course, is a huge challenge. And what I do with these books is I do the research, and then I rewrite and rewrite and rewrite, trying to make them readable by people like my mother, for example, who's my test reader, who really wouldn't normally necessarily read history and wouldn't know much about the workings of the Central Committee, for example. But in the Stalin books, I really tried to do something different. I looked at Stalin, I thought, Soviet history had been very infected, the historians in the West and probably in India too, by the Bolshevik attitude to history, which is that there was no personal life. Personal life was a bourgeois indulgence. Bourgeois morality was bad, and therefore Soviet leaders, for example, like Lenin or Stalin, had no personal life, had no private life. They simply had service to the cause, to the revolution, to dialectical materialism, and so on, and to the people, to the proletariat, and that anything else was simply bourgeois. And for many, many years, the people who wrote Soviet history actually followed this rule and were infected by it. And you're right, these books haven't been very criticized, but the people who have criticized them on this basis. I wanted to do something different. It was after the Soviet Union had fallen, and I wanted to approach Stalin as you would Louis XIV or Akbar the Great, or a great king and a great ruler. And I wanted to look at the whole, the society, as well as policy and as well as ideology. And so when I started to research these papers, I found there was massive material for this that no one had used at all, ever. And I was very lucky also because, as you mentioned again, I mean, every writer has to be lucky. And, you know, luck is everything in this game. And I was very lucky because I wrote my book on Potyomkin and Catherine, and it was 1999, and bizarrely, it found favor in the Kremlin. And President Putin had just become acting president and then president, and it was his liberal phase, which seems like a long time ago, right? And I think he actually read this book, the Catherine book, and he doesn't read many books, unlike Stalin, whose houses were piled high with books and manuscripts that he was reading and annotating. Putin really reads little, and the only thing he reads are political biographies of Russian rulers, apparently. And so for some reason he read this book, and it was exactly the same time that George W. Bush came on his visit, his first meeting with Putin. And he, by coincidence, was given the book by Kissinger, by Henry Kissinger. This is appalling name dropping, forgive me in advance. But he had also read it. And when he arrived to see Putin at the Hermitage Museum, the Winter Palace, Putin said, "I want to show you everything about Peter the Great." And Bush said, "Actually, I want to see everything to do with Potyomkin." And so, they'd somehow warned, they'd been warned. So they discussed Catherine the Great and Potyomkin. And so I was in favor, and I was called in by the Minister of Culture of the Russian Federation, and he said to me, "You're in favor with the Kremlin. It's been read in very high places." And we wondered if you would, and what impressed them was that this book is very pro-Russian, in the sense that you don't treat Catherine the Great as a nymphomaniac, but as a statesman. And you don't treat Potyomkin as a sort of buffoonish pimp. And you rehabilitate them as great statesmen. So we would like to offer you something. Do you have any interest in the private papers of Joseph Stalin? So this is like a dream come true for any historian. And literally, I said yes, because I've just signed a contract to write a book called Stalin, the Court of the Red Tsar. And they said, "Well, you're in luck then. And come to us, you can come to the Marxism-Leninism Institute, and you can use the papers, and we will help you." And so I was given my own room. All the experts on the handwriting of Beria and Molotov and Mikoyan and all these people helped me every day, and they brought me piles of documents, and it was amazing. But when I published the book, they hated it. And I lost all my status with the Kremlin. And when I arrived, they hated the book because it shows the way Stalin ran things in a totally personal way, that it was a totally personal dictatorship, and in many ways irresponsible and cruel and capricious and more. And they hated that because the regime in Russia itself was changing by 2003, 2004, and becoming much more absolutist, much more authoritarian. So when I turned up at the archives to write Young Stalin, the sequel to Stalin, the Court of the Red Tsar, when I went to the Minister of Culture, when I saw all my old friends, they all wouldn't help me. And when I went to the archives, I said, "Can I have my old special room?" They said, "We don't remember you ever having a room." And when I said, "But it's me, it's Montefiore, I'm back," they said, "We don't really remember you. Were you ever here?" And when I said, "Can you bring up some documents from the archives?" they said, "There's a problem with that." Because they said, in the holidays, there was an accident. 2 young soldiers from the Ministry of the Interior who were guarding the archives, they got drunk and they fell down the lift shaft. And their bodies are at the bottom of the lift shaft. So we can't bring you up any papers from the archives. So they said, "It's a bit of an accident, but these things happen." So as you know, all of those of you who are interested in Russia, you know everything in Russia is a mixture of accident and conspiracy, right? And so this is a classic accident and conspiracy mix. So I had no documents for young Stalin. But I was very lucky again because I had a lot of the documents from my first visit, including amazing papers about Stalin's youth and school days. And so instead I went to Georgia, Stalin's homeland, where I knew many of the leaders and so on because I'd been going there since 1991. And I was able to get into the archives there because Georgia had its own Marxism-Leninism Institute, as you will know. And I found amazing things there, including the memoirs of Stalin's mother, which is quite an exciting thing to find, as you can imagine. So that's how I got into the Russian archives and sadly got out. That's how I felt the golden warm glow of the Kremlin's favor and the cold, cold wind of the taiga tundra of Siberia.
But having actually done all this, you did something which I think is something which among scholars was never wholly acceptable. And Richard Pipes, etc., were very, very worried about all this, which is that somehow you humanized what they all considered to be a monster. I mean, somewhere, I think in India, we don't automatically write monstrosity into Stalin because we kind of think of the Soviet Union as having been an experience which somewhere helped with our national liberation and with the creation of independence movements and the like. But in the West, surely you became not only persona non grata on one side, but also persona non grata on another side. But nevertheless, you grew and prospered, as it were. Now, that's a very, very funny situation to be in.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yes, historians like Pipes, for example, were initially very skeptical about this project because they feared it would overhumanize him. And I'm very aware, by the way, of the sort of the Soviet friendship to India during its early decades. During the Nehru years, of course, there was a special relationship, and so that affected, of course, and influenced the Indian attitude to the Soviet Union in many ways. And so Stalin is more warmly regarded here than he might be, say, in England or America, as a rule. But I think the point about humanization is a very interesting one. I thought very hard about this. And I decided that actually, part of the role of us historians is to give warnings from history and to show how things really happened. So let's take Adolf Hitler, for example, as a more neutral person who didn't help Indian independence. I think most histories of Hitler, such as the ones I was taught as a little boy, they just said, we were taught at school, we were taught that Hitler was a kind of madman who has just got control of a huge country and then conquered most of Europe for a few years and then did the Holocaust. So we were just taught that he was just a kind of demented devil, a sort of satanic figure. But this didn't explain in any way how such a man was gifted a politician enough to get control of Germany, how he was gifted a communicator to intoxicate, to enchant the sophisticated public of Germany, how he was talented enough as a commander-in-chief to knock France completely out of the war and conquer most of Europe, to outwit the prime ministers of the Western democracies, Daladier and Chamberlain, sophisticated enough to persuade the Wehrmacht to invade Russia on his orders, and to persuade millions of people, hundreds of thousands of people, to take part in the industrial slaughter of the entire Jewish people. This explained nothing. In fact, if you need to understand Hitler, you need to understand that he began as an unusual but talented politician who used all the methods of modern politics, communication, radio, presentation, spectacular presentation, who really understood politics, who understood democratic politics, actually was brilliant at manipulating a democratic politics. something which we're seeing today in countries like America, for example. And so I have always believed that, one needed to look at Hitler in much more detail and understand how he converted normal modes of behavior into a Hitlerian new mode of morality or amorality. And so Hitler needed to be seen in detail, in personality, in order to see this, how he persuaded people to believe in him, to believe that he was manipulatable, and so on. So you'll see in modern biographies of Hitler by Ian Kershaw, for example, they treat the personality as extremely important. And in my biographies of Stalin, the same thing. When I was researching in the archives, for example, in 1930 to 33, I found many letters from Stalin to his top henchmen in which, for page after page, he begged them to back him in collectivization, to back him in industrialization and the first 5-year plan, to back him as millions of people died of famine, and to stick with him. And he would persuade them and beg them to help him, sympathize with their doubts, and so on. And these letters had never been used by any historians. So here is Stalin acting like a normal politician, not the man who everyone was terrified of before 1937, before the Great Terror. He had to persuade these people to back him. And he used methods very like a normal politician. I mean, yes, like a machine politician of a big city, for example, like Chicago, maybe a sort of slightly gangsterish politician, but still a recognizable politician, not a sort of bloody tyrant. And so I realized that really, to understand Stalin, you need to realize that actually he wasn't a sort of satanic machine. He was actually an excellent politician, maybe not one suited to a modern democracy, for example, but one who was extremely well suited to the very limited politics of the Communist Party and the Russian polity, the Soviet polity of the 20s, for example. And so I wanted to show this in my writing, and I wanted to show how he worked to persuade people. The fact of the matter was, Stalin was a people person as a politician. He was excellent with people. Trotsky offended everybody he dealt with and was unable to really build much of a faction, much of a following. Stalin was brilliant at persuading people to back him. His very modesty, his very lack of flashiness, for example, in his speeches and in personality, the modesty of the man worked extremely well with the rank-and-file Bolsheviks. Anyway, when I came to write, for example, the years of the terror, again, I wanted to give you readers the compliment of being able to judge the morality of a personality and a system. So, for example, on a typical day, Stalin might write to his son's teacher at school, and he might see his daughter Svetlana, and he might read her homework and sign her homework as parents did in Soviet Russia with teachers. Later that night, he might see his secret police chief, and he might sign a death list that would execute 7,000 people. And he would go down this death list. One has to remember these death lists, everybody in the death list was innocent of any crime that we would recognize. He might let one person live by putting a dash beside their name, but everybody else he would sign, and he would pass this round the Politburo table, and he would ask them all to sign, and they would all sign and say things like, shoot this prostitute, kill this bastard. And then the death list was given to the head of the secret police, and the secret police would arrest these people and execute them instantly. He would also pass around the Politburo table a note from his daughter Svetlana. Svetlana, this is also one of the great documents I found in the archives. When Svetlana was about 7 or 8 years old, she liked to pretend to be dictator of Russia. And Stalin played along with this game. And she would write orders to Stalin and the Politburo, saying things like, from the first secretary of the Communist Party, Svetlana Stalin, aged 7 or 10 or whatever, I hereby order that you should abolish homework for the entire Soviet Union. And Stalin would then pass this around the Politburo table, and they would all sign it and say, "We agree." And they would then stick this on the fridge in their house. So these stories, some of these stories, are great fun and show a normal home life for Stalin. And some of them show Stalin as a bloody tyrant, executing people at random. I believe that my reader is sophisticated enough to judge, to make the correct moral judgment on this person and his activities of that day. And I believe that generally people have made this judgment, and that it makes this a more powerful warning to show how totalitarian states, how murderous totalitarian states are set up and created.
Somewhere or another, I think these tendencies exist in practically everybody. It's simply the way in which actually life works out, and you decide on what path you actually take. Yeah. But it's an interesting set of questions that you raise, because in a way it requires, though, a very large biography. It cannot simply be a biography in which there are clear lines automatically drawn out that allows you to think about people in these terms. These biographies, I mean, I'm thinking back to a session which happened just, one ago. These biographies don't normally happen. I mean, by and large, we accept that biographies are meant to somehow tell us about how great people became great, and in a strange way, how small people remain small. And the other bits, the warts and all, are things that we are not going to actually tolerate in much of what we wrote. So in India, for instance, I don't think one could think about writing that kind of a biography about a leading figure, whether it be Subhash Chandra Bose, or whether it be Gandhi, or whether it be Nehru as yet. Because, very frankly, you would be pilloried everywhere for having done it. Now, why do you think that somehow it has been possible for you to ultimately write the kind of biography you wrote? I mean, is it because ultimately people didn't particularly like Stalin and they weren't concerned with Russia? What do you think the magic which enabled you, as it were, both to unlock as well as to survive the...
Yeah. I'll come to the unlocking in a second, but I think that the interesting thing is that in Western, first of all, in English and American history writing now, very detailed archival research is now expected of these sort of books, first of all. And secondly, as I said in the answer earlier, I think that readers have become used to judging people and to receiving a broad, warts and all, an analysis of these characters, and to judging them by their political acts and personal acts as well. I think third is a realization that heroes and monsters. I once published a book called Heroes and Monsters, but I actually think that people now are way beyond heroes and monsters. I think readers want more sophistication than that now, and I think that these books reflect that. And I think that the last point is, which is most relevant, is that suddenly we have access to amazing archival materials. And those archival materials are irresistible. I mean, both the books you have in front of you, Stalin and also the Romanovs, are based on amazing letters which were kept in the Russian archives. I mean, one of the great things about the Bolsheviks is that they respected history, they respected writing. And they kept in the archives everything. For example, Stalin himself preserved his own love letters to his wife in the Russian archives. He wrote to the archive. He chose to archive them, and similarly, the Bolsheviks very carefully kept all the Tsarist materials in the archives and protected it very carefully, so that it's all there. And I mean, all my works, in fact, are based on some of the great correspondences of history. Now, the great things about letters, which don't apply to political documents, and certainly don't apply to most government documents, is that they're expected never to be read. And most of the correspondences I use, much of the materials in the Stalin books, both the Stalin books, but especially in the Romanov book, which is my most recent big one, is most of those letters, the Tsars were sending love letters to each other and letters to their ministers that they really never expected to be ever read. And in fact, they were carried by couriers, and some were destroyed, but many survived. I mean, for example, the letters of Catherine and Potemkin, the letters of Peter the Great and his wife, Catherine I. I mean, many of these letters are very shocking. They're very saucy. They're very sexual. And a lot of people are very shocked that I've put them into these books. And I have been criticized for putting these very erotic letters in. But the essential lesson of this is that if we've learned any lesson from modern historiography, it is that personality does make a huge difference in political history. I mean, you only have to look at the case of Donald Trump, the characters of Donald Trump, the characters of Vladimir Putin, to see that personality is very important. One only has to study the great monarchs of history, the great politicians, to see that personal decisions were very interlinked with political decisions, even among the Bolsheviks, who were so self-consciously determined to be impersonal manifestations of the will of the people. And Stalin made personal decisions all the time. He also made political decisions all the time. So I wanted to reflect that in these books. And I wanted to use the materials that I was lucky enough to find. I mean, a lot of these letters, I mean, for example, there are erotic letters. Let's bring in a new personality, Alexander II, the Russian Tsar and Emperor who liberated the serfs, the slaves of Russia in 1861, as every schoolboy knows. His correspondence with his mistress, Katya Dolgorukaya, for example, is probably the most sexually explicit correspondence, I think, ever written by a head of state. If you read it, prepare to be shocked. But it's also very political. It's also all about politics. It's about ministers. It's about the wars they are fighting. In other words, in Russian history, it's all about closeness to the body, as they say in Russian, closeness to the monarch. And, in Russian history, closeness, access to the leader is all important. And I'm sure it's the same in Indian history. It's even the same in British democracy. And so these personal letters are extremely relevant. I mean, Stalin's letters to his top henchmen, for example, from the 30s, are very long, very fascinating. There's a lot of gossip in them. There's a lot of politics in them. And these two things are totally interwoven and intertwined and inseparable. So these are the books I've written. These are the books I've written where the personal and the political are very interlinked.
Now you've mentioned it. Obviously, though, you were touching on enormous terrain of personal experience. But somehow you found that in order, as a writer, to be satisfied with what you're conveying, this non-fiction that you were writing was inadequate. I mean, somewhere you wanted to do more. That's why you wrote this Moscow trilogy that you've written. Now, why the fictive? In fact, if so much is possible through the non-fictive.
Well, I've loved writing my Moscow trilogy, and I'm very excited because it's just been bought to be made into a TV drama on one of the platforms. So it's very exciting. And there are 3 novels in it, the Moscow trilogy: Sashenka, One Night in Winter, and the new one, Red Sky at Noon. And in these novels, I really look at the personal. I mean, they are love stories. They're about family life. And I didn't do that in these books, except where serious high politics was involved. And in fact, when I was writing these books, I've written 5 of these big serious history books, including Jerusalem, and then 4 Russian ones. And in those ones, I stuck very, very strictly to what was in the archives, to what was in these letters. And that was a challenge. I was often accused of writing these books too easily, making them too readable, making them even novelistic. But in fact, I was absolutely punctilious in not inventing anything and not imagining anything and sticking strictly to what was in the sources. But at the same time, I researched the lives of many ordinary people, and I met many people from the families of the leaders. I met families of all the sort of the great Bolshevik families. I met the Molotovs and the Berias and talked to them about what it was like to live in this era. So I had a very good feel for the texture of life, ordinary life. I say ordinary life, privileged life in this period. One time I was looking in the archives of the NKVD, of the secret police, and I found a photograph of an incredibly beautiful woman with gray eyes. And I looked at it and I thought, like, oh my God, this is a woman who was arrested. She was the mother of 2 children. She was arrested in June 1937. She was the editor of a magazine. She was taken to Lefortovo or one of these, or Lubyanka prison, and they took this photograph of her. And this was the last photograph ever taken of her. And as she looked into this camera, she didn't know what was going to happen to her. But she was thinking of her family, I'm sure. And 5 days after taking this photograph, this beautiful woman who was about 33 years old was taken downstairs into the cellars. And the cellars in Lubyanka were specially designed for executions. They had sloping floor, and one wall was made out of logs to absorb bullets. And they were designed with tiles. The other 4 walls were all tiled for easy wiping. And the floor was also sloping and with tiles like a shower, so that the blood ran down into a sort of drain. And she was taken into that room, and she was shot in the back of the head. And on Stalin's orders, because somehow her family was on one of the lists. Only people who were known to the leaders were on the lists. Everyone else in the provinces was shot by quota. And this story struck me so powerfully that I wanted to write a novel about this woman. And I didn't know anything more about her, so I invented the story, and that's the story of Sashenka. And it's the story of how she had the challenge of saving herself or her children. And if you read the book, you'll see the choice she made. And it was based on many stories that I read, and that couldn't be in the history book.
Very quickly, before we ask for the open up to the audience, you've tired a little of Russia. I mean, the very fact that you went to Jerusalem and that you're thinking of many other things now, that indicates that somehow you want to do other things. Can you talk a little bit about the other things?
Yeah, first of all, Jerusalem was a huge project for me, and it's really it's the history book that I'm most proud of, because writing about Jerusalem is a very difficult thing. And the reason why, when I started to write it, I wanted to write a history of the Middle East. I'd been going to Jerusalem since I was a little boy. My family had a connection to Jerusalem. And in fact, my ancestor, who I mentioned earlier, the Montefiore from the 19th century, had founded the new city of Jerusalem outside the city walls in 1860. He built the first village outside, which is still called the Montefiore Cottages, or the Montefiore Windmill is part of it. And those of you who've been to Jerusalem might have seen it. So I'd always wanted to write the history of Jerusalem. And I came from a Jewish family connected to Zionism. But I wanted to write a book that was absolutely neutral and that was not pro-Zionist, but not pro-Palestinian, pro-Arab either. I wanted to tell the truth of all the sects, of all the empires, of all the leaders that ruled there, from the Canaanites and King David up to the age of Obama and Netanyahu and Arafat and so on. So this was, I thought this would be an easy thing to do. I couldn't, I wanted to, first of all, I wanted to read a book like this. And in fact, all my books are based on the same search. And I always think of my hero Disraeli, Benjamin Disraeli, the English Prime Minister, who you know well in India because he made Victoria Empress of India. But one of the things he said was, you know, he said, when I want to read a book, I write it myself if he can't find it. And I couldn't find a history of all of Jerusalem. So I decided to write it. It turned out to be a total nightmare. Writing about Jerusalem is the hardest thing. My father said to me, he said to me, Simon, good luck on this project. But if you say that King David didn't exist, I will never speak to you again. And my Armenian friend said to me, if you don't make very clear that the Armenian massacres were a genocide, we'll never speak to you again. My Palestinian friends said, if you don't mention the Deir Yassin massacre, we'll never speak to you again. I didn't sleep for 3 years worrying about all these responsibilities of writing this history. Because after all, in Jerusalem, people are killed for history every day. People die from history every day. So it was a big responsibility. And I really worked hard to create this book. I wanted it to be a biography of a city, a new sort of city history, treating the city as a personality. Hence it's called Jerusalem, the Biography. But it's also a history of the world through Jerusalem, a history of the Middle East. And I've just been writing an update to include Donald Trump in it, who's made a fascinating intervention, as you know. So that's that. And I've also been lucky enough to make 5, I think, TV series for the BBC. Started off writing, the first one was about Jerusalem, and then I did Rome, Istanbul, Spain, and Vienna. So that's been wonderful. And lately I've been spending really a lot of time helping develop my books, all of them, as movies and TV drama series. So Angelina Jolie has bought Catherine the Great, and she is hopefully going to star as Catherine the Great, which could be quite exciting. And Young Stalin, I think, is going to be filmed this year as a movie. And Stalin Red Tsar hopefully will be a TV series, and we're talking to a very big film star to play Stalin. And then the novels as well, and everything. Anyway, so I've been spending a lot of time doing that and also writing my own scripts on independent created subjects. So all of this is very exciting. And then, of course, finally, I should say I'm writing a history of the world now, which is an adventure for me, a new experience. But when you're writing, I think the key thing is always to keep yourself excited and interested. And writing is an adventure. I think life is an adventure. Anything is possible. It's short. And one just has to write. One just has to write it. And so I'm starting that in about a year's time.
I've had the monopoly of you. Can we ask for others to come up? I'm certain that there are people who have questions for you, the audience. Please. I think there are people at the back as well that I should...
I'd like to ask one question. Recently, one professor, Grover Farr, he's a professor of medieval English literature at Montclair State University in New Jersey. He stated in an interview that the international notion about the cruelty and that sort of attitude of Joseph Stalin is mostly not true. It's based on the, due to the lies of Khrushchev and the Western media, which perpetuated it to malign Joseph Stalin. Any comment about this Professor Grover Farr's interview, please?
Shall we take 2 or 3 questions?
Yeah, let's take a few.
Okay, let's take.
You can remember them.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Spasiba. Thank you.
Okay.
You concluded with the very important practice of responsibility. And I think it's a great challenge because in historiography, there is a lot of talk about right to historical representation. So as you are trying to represent different voices, but also while representing different voices, you are trying to be in a mode of responsibility. I would request you to reflect a little bit on that. Then what is the connection between your earlier work on Soviet history and world history? For example, while writing on about all these historical events, there is already a world historical entwined with the figures that you are writing about. If you'd like to elaborate on that. Thank you.
Yeah, let's take those two quickly, and then we will give me that one. Thank you. But just to answer your question, I mean, of course, I don't know the interview that you were talking about, that you quoted from, this gentleman here. But I should say that I have no doubt at all about the facts of Stalin's crimes and Stalin's mass killings. I mean, many of the I mean, just to give you one example, in the documents, in the archives, there are several documents, many documents, that show the orders to arrest, to kill. I mean, in 1937, all of these documents are preserved by the communists themselves, and they show the orders to deal with people in 3 columns. You've probably seen these as well. To deal with, to arrest, to deport, and to execute by numbers, by town, for example. So it might say Kolkata, arrest 100,000, exile to Siberia, 20,000, execute 20,000. These all exist, and so I really don't think there's any serious case for the exaggeration or invention of Stalin's crimes. I mean, the one thing, Khrushchev wasn't completely truthful, as we know. He didn't confess to the mass number in the secret speech. He didn't admit to the huge numbers of people killed in the famines, in collectivization, and he didn't admit to all of those in 37 either. Certainly didn't confess to his own crimes. So, anyway, that's that. And as for the question from the front, from this gentleman in the front, yeah, I mean, in my books, in these books, I'm not trying to write world history. And though world history is taking place, as you said, intertwined, as world history is taking place intertwined around the subject, I've deliberately taken a very intimate, very, very intimate they are all intimate court histories of the regime. And really what I'm fascinated with, and I'm answering in these questions, is how are these governments run? How did the leading personalities run them? How are decisions made? And I try to imagine at all times, who did you go to if you wanted to see the leader, the Tsar, the Stalin, who did you go to? How would you go about getting a decision made? And that, after all, is the essential question of all history, of all political history. Lenin himself knew that well in his famous question, whom? So I think that answers those 2 questions. And if there are any more, we have very little time, don't we?
We have one at the back.
Yeah.
How many more?
Hi, Simon. Okay. It really saddens me. Even today, especially in Calcutta, we celebrated Stalin on his birthday, and we post pictures on Facebook and all. Yeah. We simply try to efface out the Great Purge between 1933 to 1935. We simply don't accept that. And that's also due to the fact that you just said, just back, that we have a Bolshevik attitude to history. And we still have in our presence a very powerful communist party, which is a central democratic party, which is socialist fascist party. And they believe in centralism. So this is very saddening. We simply don't accept that Stalin was a mass murderer. That's all.
Yeah, and I think that's fascinating to hear. And I should say, what this gentleman at the front was saying was, what my books are about is what happened, but also they don't assign responsibility in a crude way, but they are all about responsibility for actions taken. No matter what the normal morality of the time, that we all have to face history for our actions. And reading these books, and especially the novels too, they're really about what would we have done in that time, and we have to ask ourselves that at all times. And it's interesting that here in India, people put up pictures of Stalin. I should say, and celebrate his birthday. I'll tell you something, one strange thing of writing these books, and I think we've got time for one more question, maybe, is that one of the strangest, on a lighter note, one of the strangest phenomena I've had is that in my book, Young Stalin, I don't know if you've seen this book, it has a picture of the young Stalin on the cover, and you may know the picture. And for some reason, this picture has become a cult photograph. The front of the book has become a cult photograph on Twitter amongst millennials in America. And so I'm regularly written to by teenagers who are praising Stalin not only as a communist leader, but for his looks as well. So we still live in strange times.
Somewhat early in the conversation here, conversation, the two of you touched upon the fact that how very little is known about the personal lives of the former leaders of the Soviet Union, how you tried to sort of change that through your writings. Now, do you see that as a coincidence that very little is known about the personal life of Vladimir Putin also? And is that somewhat a coincidental throwback to the autocratic times minus the communism now?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a great last question too. First of all, Putin has kept his private life incredibly secret, which would never happen in any other, in a normal democracy. Not in India, not in America, not in Britain. So yes, there is a very Soviet attitude to his private life. And of course, he's a child of the Soviet Union. So that's a very good point. Putin is really a fascinating character. He's fused the vibe, if you like, of Soviet leadership with Tsarist leadership to create Putinism, which is a fascinating phenomenon, all of its own, which we could talk about. And he's a fascinating character. I think he'll be in power for many years to come. And those of you, maybe we should just finish by saying that you may well know that his grandfather was probably the most world historical chef of all time. He cooked for Rasputin, Lenin, and Stalin, which is quite an extraordinary thing. And perhaps that's a good place, an absurd moment to finish this talk on. But thank you very much for having me. It's lovely to be here. Thank you. And thank you very much, Hari.
It's been a great pleasure. I'm certain all of you have enjoyed our meeting and listening to Simon Sebag Montefiore. Thank you very much indeed, Simon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vasudevan. Thank you, Simon. And I'm so sorry to be this rude, ruthless editor who cuts short the most interesting discussions. But citizens of the arts, I will keep using that word, as Jan referred to us as. If you have any more burning questions, please, Simon will be there at the Story kiosk outside to sign his books. He will only be signing copies of his own books and will not be signing any scraps of paper. Thank you so much, Simon, and thank you, Dr. Vasudevan.